Yo, what's up everybody? Today we're going on a journey through time and space, diving deep into the rich and complex history of Africa. We're about to dive deep into some serious history here, the kind they don't always teach you in school. You know, the kind that really makes you think and question what you thought you knew. We're talking about Africa, a continent bursting with resources, diverse cultures, and a whole lot of potential. From the vast Sahara Desert to the lush rainforests, Africa is a land of contrasts and beauty. But instead of celebrating all that, Europe decided to play a little game called colonization. They saw Africa not as a partner, but as a prize to be won. Yep, they carved up Africa like a birthday cake, except nobody invited the people who actually lived there. Imagine someone throwing a party in your house without even asking you. Think about it. For centuries, Europeans saw Africa as this mysterious land, full of adventure and, more importantly, untapped riches. They were fascinated by the unknown and driven by greed. They sent explorers to map the terrain, to find the best trade routes, and to basically scope out the place. These explorers were like the advance team, setting the stage for what was to come. You know, like when you go to a party early to figure out where the good snacks are. Except in this case, these snacks were entire nations and their resources. But here's the thing, Africa wasn't some empty land just waiting for Europeans to show up. It was a continent teeming with life, culture, and history. It was already home to powerful kingdoms, complex social structures, and vibrant cultures. These societies had their own systems of governance, trade, and art. But that didn't stop the Europeans. Oh no, they saw an opportunity, and they weren't going to let a little thing like existing civilizations get in their way. They held meetings and signed treaties, all without the consent of the African people. They saw an opportunity, and they weren't going to let a little thing like existing civilizations get in their way. They imposed their will, often through force, and reshaped the continent to suit their needs. But the African people didn't just sit back and accept this. They resisted, fought back, and struggled to maintain their way of life. And this resistance wasn't just a footnote in history, it was a powerful movement that eventually led to the independence of many African nations. Leaders and heroes emerged, inspiring their people to reclaim their land and their identity. Today, Africa is still on a journey of rediscovery and growth. The scars of colonization are still there, but so is the resilience and strength of its people. The continent continues to evolve, blending its rich heritage with modern advancements. The future of Africa is bright, with its youth leading the way in technology, innovation, and cultural renaissance. The story of Africa is far from over, and it's one that the world needs to pay attention to. So as we wrap up this chapter, remember that Africa is not just a continent divided by history, but a land united by its spirit and potential. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the untold stories of our world. So picture this, it's 1884, and a bunch of European dudes in fancy suits are chilling in Berlin. They've gathered in a grand room filled with the aroma of cigars and the clinking of fine china. They're sipping their tea, nibbling on biscuits, and oh yeah, deciding the fate of an entire continent. The atmosphere is deceptively casual, but the stakes couldn't be higher. Welcome to the Berlin Conference, where the only people missing from the table were, you guessed it, Africans. Not a single African voice was heard, not a single African perspective considered. This wasn't some friendly get-together, though. It was more like a land grab, with each European power trying to outdo the other. They were like kids in a candy store, except the candy was entire nations and the store was a continent. I'll take that part. No, that's mine. The room was filled with heated debates and negotiations, each country trying to secure the largest and most resource-rich territories. They drew lines on maps, dividing up Africa without any regard for the people who lived there, their cultures, or their history. These arbitrary borders would later become the source of countless conflicts and struggles. Imagine someone just drawing lines on a map of Europe and saying, okay, you guys are now part of this country, and you guys over there, you're with them. It sounds absurd, right? But that's exactly what happened in Africa. The Berlin Conference was a prime example of European arrogance and entitlement. They believed they had the right to reshape the world according to their whims, without any consideration for the people who actually lived there. They treated Africa like a giant monopoly board, completely ignoring the fact that millions of people were already living their lives, with their own systems of governance and trade. These societies had rich histories, complex cultures, and vibrant economies. It was a recipe for disaster, and the consequences would be felt for generations to come. The arbitrary borders created by the Berlin Conference would lead to ethnic conflicts, civil wars, and a legacy of division and strife that still affects Africa today. The impact of the Berlin Conference didn't end with the drawing of borders. It set the stage for decades of exploitation, oppression, and resistance. African leaders and communities fought tirelessly to reclaim their autonomy and dignity. The struggle for independence was long and arduous, but it was also a testament to the resilience and strength of African peoples. Despite the immense challenges imposed by colonial rule, they persevered and eventually won their freedom. Today, Africa is a continent of diverse nations, each with its own unique identity and story. The legacy of the Berlin Conference is still felt, but so is the spirit of resistance and renewal. Africa continues to rise, reclaiming its place on the global stage. The story of the Berlin Conference is a reminder of the dangers of arrogance and the importance of respecting the sovereignty and dignity of all peoples. It's a chapter of history that we must remember, so we can build a future that honors the rich tapestry of human experience. Now you might be wondering, why go through all this trouble? What were the Europeans really after? Well, it all boils down to three things: economics, culture, and ego. Think of it as a three-headed monster, each head hungrier than the last. Let's start with economics. Africa was like a treasure chest for European powers, overflowing with raw materials like gold, diamonds, rubber, and ivory. They needed these resources to fuel their industrial revolutions back home. It was all about profit, plain and simple. Then there was the cultural aspect. Many Europeans saw Africans as uncivilized and believed it was their duty to civilize them. They wanted to impose their own cultures, languages, and religions on the African people. You know, the classic "we know better than you" attitude. And finally, we have the ego trip. Colonizing Africa was a way for European nations to flex their muscles and show off their power. It was all about prestige and competition, about who could control the most land and resources. Basically, they were acting like that kid in school who always had to one-up everyone else. Section 4. Divide and conquer the tools of colonization. So how exactly did Europeans manage to take control of vast swathes of Africa? The answer lies in a combination of brute force, cunning diplomacy, and strategic infrastructure development. Well, they had a few tricks up their sleeves, and none of them were pretty. These methods were often ruthless and calculated, designed to ensure European dominance over African territories. We're talking about military force, deceitful treaties, and sneaky infrastructure projects. Each of these tools played a crucial role in the colonization process, and they were used in tandem to subjugate and control the local populations. First up, the muscle military force. European powers deployed their well-trained and well-equipped armies to crush any form of resistance they encountered. European powers weren't afraid to use their superior weapons and tactics to subdue African resistance. Their advanced military technology, including firearms and artillery, gave them a significant advantage over the indigenous forces. They crushed rebellions, intimidated local rulers, and basically made it clear who was boss. The display of military might was often enough to coerce local leaders into submission, ensuring that European interests were prioritized. But brute force wasn't their only weapon. The Europeans also employed more subtle and insidious methods to achieve their goals. They also used sneaky tactics like treaties. These agreements were often presented as mutually beneficial, but they were loaded with hidden clauses that favored the colonizers. They'd approach African leaders with seemingly friendly agreements, promising trade and protection. These treaties were often signed under duress or without a full understanding of their implications. But these treaties were often written in tricky language that the Africans didn't fully understand. The legal jargon and foreign languages used in these documents made it difficult for African leaders to grasp the true nature of the agreements. By the time they realized what they'd signed, it was too late. The treaties often ceded large tracts of land and significant resources to the Europeans, leaving the local populations with little recourse. And then there were the infrastructure projects. These projects were presented as efforts to modernize and develop the colonies, but Their true purpose was far more self-serving. Europeans built railroads, roads and ports, but not necessarily for the benefit of Africans. These infrastructure developments were designed to facilitate the extraction and transportation of resources from the colonies to Europe. These projects were designed to extract resources more efficiently and to solidify European control over the land. The railroads and roads connected resource-rich areas to ports, enabling the swift movement of goods to European markets. It was all about connecting the colonies to European interests, not about developing the colonies themselves. The infrastructure served the needs of the colonizers, often at the expense of the local populations who saw little benefit from these projects. African labor was exploited to build these projects, with little regard for the well-being of the workers. The harsh working conditions and lack of fair compensation further entrenched the power imbalance between the colonizers and the colonized. In essence, the tools of colonization were multifaceted and deeply entrenched in the fabric of colonial governance. Military force, deceitful treaties, and strategic infrastructure projects were all part of a broader strategy to dominate and exploit African territories. Understanding these tools helps us to comprehend the lasting impact of colonization on the African continent. The legacy of these practices continues to shape the political, economic, and social landscapes of many African nations today. Despite the challenges imposed by colonization, African nations have shown remarkable resilience and strength. The journey towards reclaiming autonomy and fostering development continues, driven by the spirit and determination of the African people. Section 5: Scars on a Continent: The Impact of Colonial Rule. The consequences of European colonization were devastating for Africa. We're not just talking about physical scars on the land, but deep wounds on the soul of a continent. Colonial rule disrupted African societies in profound ways. Traditional power structures were undermined, local economies were exploited, and entire communities were displaced. It's like someone coming into your house, rearranging all your furniture, and then telling you they're doing you a favor. One of the biggest problems was the creation of artificial borders. Remember those lines the Europeans drew on the map in Berlin? Well, those lines became the borders of new countries, often lumping together different ethnic groups who had their own histories and rivalries. This created a recipe for conflict and instability that continues to plague many African nations today. The legacy of colonialism is like a shadow that still hangs over Africa. It's a reminder of a time when the continent was exploited, divided, and denied its rightful place on the world stage.